Claire will tell you a little bit more about the work we're doing at Julie's Bicycle, as she is much closer connected to JB. She is actually in London, while I am a little bit more of a satellite. I'm an associate partner of Julie's Bicycle for the past 10 years. And just briefly to say that I actually wear two hats, because on one hand, I am the founding member and general secretary of Mythos 21. It's a European theatre network bringing together some of the biggest public national theatres in Europe. And the other hat is my Julie's Bicycle partnership. I've spent most of my working life in theatre as a dramaturg, artistic advisor, and international projects manager. And I've been doing consultancy, lecturing, training, capacity building in the field of culture and sustainability for the past 15 years. And the two hats have come together into my book, Sustainable Theatre Theory, Context, Practice, which was published 3 years ago by Bloomsbury, Matthew and Drama. So what I wanted to offer, without taking up too much time from the main topic, is to give a little bit of context about why we're all here. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about how climate awareness has been built over the years, what a long way it has been, and how the arts and culture have become engaged gradually, slowly, but in recent years, more deeply and more effectively. So briefly, let's say that we start with the 60s and 70s with the environmental movements being born, and increasingly scientists warning against the dire effects of climate change. Then a big landmark is the Brundtland Commission by the UN, the report that introduces sustainable development into the global political discourse. Then we jump to 2015, another landmark, the Paris Agreement, an international treaty to halt global warming. You all remember 2019 with a very big global movements, Fridays for Future, Greta Thunberg, which mobilized civic society. The same year, we have this very strong open public discussion that begins in the US about a Green New Deal towards a greener future. In 2020, we have actually the EU Green Deal. It's the new legislation that moves Europe towards climate neutrality. And then, of course, we all remember the COVID-19 pandemic. One positive outcome of which was that it was connected to environmental issues, and eventually it seems that it did help raise awareness. In 2022, we have another landmark legislation, the US Climate Bill, which was a very advanced national climate legislation besides the EU Green Deal. And then, of course, over the past 30, 40 years, we have climate change, which is a reality and which is increasingly felt across the globe. Just very briefly to make a few points about these landmark moments in history. In 1987, the Brundtland Commission by the UN published the report Our Common Future, and it was the first time that the idea of sustainable development was introduced in the public sphere. And it's important to say that the definition of back then is still the definition that we're using today. So sustainable development is a kind of development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Then the other pillar in 2015 is the Paris Climate Agreement. That was a historical document that legally binds the whole world to participate in climate change fight. It was signed by 196 countries, and the goal was to try and hold the increase of global temperature under 2 degrees Celsius, ideally under 1.5 degrees Celsius. And of course, we all know the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were published in 2015 by the United Nations, and how much they have influenced the way we work, the way we think about the future in our lives, and of course, also in the cultural sector. Now, two political landmarks. In 2020, the European Green Deal, which was a set of policy initiatives by the European Commission with the aim of making Europe climate neutral in 2050. And in 2022, the Biden administration passes the Inflation Reduction Act, which in fact is the US climate legislation, the largest investment in climate in American history, which was meant to enable America to both tackle the climate crisis, to advance environmental justice, and to secure America's position as a leader in domestic clean energy manufacturing. I want to stress the importance of 2019, which was a year for climate consciousness that has to do with public awareness. And it was not only among young people, but we know now through global surveys that it really changed the perception of global population around how important climate change is. At the same time, that year saw the first, I would say, more collective reactions by the arts and culture sector across the globe to engage with the issue of climate and environment. However, that was not the first time that the arts and culture had engaged with climate and environmental issues. In fact, it was already from the mid-90s that several actors, not so many, and I would say scattered around the world, had begun to address environmental issues in connection to the kind of work we do in the arts and culture. So from 1993, where we have the first ever green guide for greener theaters, to the creation of Julie's Bicycle in 2008, the Center for Sustainable Practice in the Arts in the US, the Broadway Green Alliance, and several other initiatives that, let's say, kept the discussion alive all the way to 2015 and the Paris Agreement. During that same period, there have been some pioneering organizations that embedded the idea of environmental sustainability into their core mission and functions. For instance, the Göteborg Opera since 2004, the National Theatre in London since 2006, Sydney Theatre Company, Festival d'Avignon, and the Lyon Opera. And we have a wealth of resources, even before the Paris Agreement, due to the work of those cultural agents across the globe, resources and capacity building materials. What is most important, though, is that in 2012, we have the first example of how climate policy can be incorporated into culture policy. And that was in 2012, when the Arts Council in England, in collaboration with Julie's Bicycle, made it a funding requirement for all national portfolio organizations and museums, that is the subsidized sector, to report on their environmental impacts, energy, water, and waste, and to have an environmental policy and action plan in place. That was quite groundbreaking because, as you can imagine, it was already 15 years ago. Followed suit the Ministry of Culture in France, who also incorporated the national policy for sustainable development and for the ecological transition into the policies for the cultural sector. And likewise, in 2015, Creative Scotland created their own climate culture framework for the cultural sector. And then we get to 2020, when, because of the Green Deal, the European Parliament calls for greening as well of the EU culture and education programs. That was a very important decision, of course, because then the report, Greening the Creative Europe program, was published soon after this decision, which means that culture policies and funding programs were to align with the Green Deal. So as of then, Creative Europe program acknowledges that culture plays a fundamental role in the green transition, also helping in raising awareness and in shaping values and behavior, but also in more practical terms, in the sense that cultural and creative organization can adopt and promote greener practices. And this was reported into October 24, where the implementation meant that the quality assessment had green aspects for all projects that were submitted to Creative Europe and all the other strands, media and cross arts projects. Meaning that the project had to have planning tools that were striving for greener practices, to look into energy consumption, waste management, green procurement, mobility, training and capacity building, awareness raising, measurement, and monitoring. This trend, on behalf of the European Commission, helped other national agents to move towards the same direction. For instance, in 2020, the Federal Cultural Foundation in Germany launched the first such pilot program by financing and helping 19 culture organizations to do a carbon footprint report and then share the results with other organizations. And very importantly, and I would suggest to anyone who is interested in climate culture policy to have a look at the website of the Ministry of Culture in France. The new iteration of the culture policy incorporating ecological concerns in France is quite exemplar. It has been published since 2 years ago, and it concerns the entire culture sector, with 3 main levers for action that they need to measure and collect data so that there is a creation of database for the entire sector. The ministry is financing the transition, which is, of course, very important, as we all know. And also, there is a lot of attention paid on training and capacity building. Now, all this new environment, led by the EU Green Deal and also mainstreamed into several national culture policies, created a surge of interest among our colleagues in the cultural sector. So we have lots of European and international initiatives in the past few years. Of course, the existing agencies like Julie's Bicycle and the Center for Sustainable Practice in the Arts, and Broadway Green Alliance. But then you see more and more agents getting involved. We have a new policy framework in Ireland for the culture sector. IATM and other big networks engage with sustainability in a more systematic manner. Festivals are creating their own tools and so on and so forth. And of course, we have a wealth of resources that have been created and shared for free among the cultural sector that aim to facilitate the transition to everybody. And of course, that this is something that you are going to have time to look at your own pace when the presentations are shared. But now, of course, we are a little bit at a different place right now. As we all know, climate change and environmental issues are no longer a priority in the global agenda due to several reasons. The first drawback was Russia's invasion in Ukraine. So the war there shifted attention to other issues, energy shortages, and so on and so forth. Then we had regional wars, Gaza, now the war with Iran and all that. And we all feel right now that we're not really at a very good place in relation to where we were 4 or 5 years ago. And what was worse is that the US, under the Trump administration, have withdrawn again, because he did it again in 2016. Have they withdrawn again from the Paris Agreement? And being the greater polluter, this is a very important move because it damages international climate diplomacy. It halts climate finance globally and creates a series of environmental rollbacks. In the US, it's a disaster because it ramps up oil and gas production. It has posed electric vehicle adoption, rolls back environmental regulation, and has undermined completely the role of the Environmental Protection Agency. The other worrying aspect of that is that in the Trump administration and around it, there is a big circle, a big lobby that is trying to also change the narrative around climate change. So there is a series of conferences and meetings and symposia that are trying to promote a new discourse that rejects the scientific consensus that we had achieved on climate change. However, I want to close on an optimistic and a little bit ambitious note, because we have the EU Green Deal, which still keeps the engagement to a very large degree intact. So for now, we know that the EU Green Deal has acknowledged that culture is part of the climate transition, and arts are seen as drivers of behavior change. On top of that, we see a policy shift in the last 2 years. So we're not only focusing on greening operations, but we're actually going towards deeper system change, which means that arts and culture are acknowledged as factors that can help public awareness and community engagement. Culture is now integrated across all the EU policies regarding the Green Deal, with a focus both on environmental sustainability and on societal impact. The new EU cultural strategy embeds sustainability across policy and links culture with innovation and environment. And as we already know, the new European Bauhaus, which has been running for a few years now, combines art, design, and sustainability with a focus on beauty, inclusion, and ecology, which makes or aims to make the Green Deal tangible in the lives of the citizens of Europe. Recently, we have another useful report. The importance of the Creative Shifts report is that it has been studying the EU policies connecting culture to sustainability. It has been studying initiatives of the past 20, 30 years. It's a group of national experts on culture and environment, and their job is to advise national funding bodies on how to mainstream climate policies into their own cultural policy frameworks. So the main recommendations from the report is to ramp up effective use of existing tools and data for informed decision making, to scale up existing good practices, to stimulate the creative sector through policies and institutional action, amplify knowledge and better sharing of successful approaches, and to mainstream culture into national and EU climate action. So to sum up, in the framework of the European Green Deal, the optimistic news is that culture is more and more becoming key to a green transition future. And we at Julie's Bicycle, because we've always thought that culture should and can lead the way in climate action, this is something optimistic, something to look forward to, regardless of the difficult point in world global politics that we are right now. So from me, thank you so much.